Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly paradigm-shifting analysis of American slavery and emancipation. We're looking primarily at Chapter 9 of historian Howard Zinn's incredibly influential book, A People's History of the United States. What we're doing is neutrally examining his core argument, and that argument? That the end of slavery was driven way more by calculated economic strategy and political self-preservation than by some pure, unadulterated moral crusade. We'll also be weaving in powerful perspectives from folks like Angela Davis, W.E.B. Du Bois, and George Jackson, just to see how this whole historical framework connects to the struggles of the 20th century.
To wrap our heads around this complex history, we're going to follow a quick four-part roadmap. First, the myth of submission. Second, the politics of emancipation. Third, the illusion of freedom. And finally, the continuing struggle.
Let's kick things off with part 1, the myth of submission. Now, for a really long time, traditional kind of paternalistic narratives gave us this idea of the docile slave, this myth of a population made totally submissive, supposedly just acting as helpless, content dependents. But Zinn's documentation, it shatters that illusion completely. When you actually look at the historical record, what you find is an unbroken chain of active rebellion, fierce resistance, and an absolute refusal to just submit to the system.
I mean, just look at this number. 250. According to historian Herbert Aptheker, who did deep dive research into this, 250 is the absolute minimum documented number of organized slave revolts and conspiracies that involved 10 or more people. It really goes to show that rebellion was this permanent, terrifying reality for plantation owners. The enslaved population was constantly actively organizing against their captors.
But, resistance wasn't just about armed, organized revolts. It was literally woven into everyday survival. Enslaved people would intentionally slow down their work. They'd sabotage things by destroying crops and tools, or they'd fake being sick. They ran away in massive numbers. And honestly, perhaps most profoundly, they fought tooth and nail to preserve their family and kinship ties against a system that was quite literally designed to rip them apart. This quiet, daily non-cooperation was a powerful assertion of their dignity and humanity.
Frederick Douglass, who famously escaped slavery and became a leading abolitionist, really captured this mindset perfectly. He realized early on that slavery was a human-made crime, not some divine mandate or natural order. As he put it, what man can make, man can unmake. This conscious rejection of the system proves that the burning desire for freedom was an inborn, unextinguished threat to the whole institution of slavery.
Moving right along to Section 2, the politics of emancipation. Now, we're usually taught that the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation were part of this grand, sweeping moral crusade to end the evils of slavery. But let's take a step back and ask a critical question. What do the primary documents actually reveal about President Abraham Lincoln's true motives at the time? Well, here's a crucial piece of the puzzle. This is from a really famous 1862 letter Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley. Lincoln lays it out plain and simple. His official policy prioritized national unity and economic stability over total abolition. He actually wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." He drew a hard line between his personal wish that all men could be free and his official duty as president. He was entirely willing to keep slavery intact if it meant keeping the country together. And if you look closely at the actual text of the Emancipation Proclamation from 1863, Zinn points out something fascinating. It was fundamentally a strategic military maneuver. It literally only freed enslaved people in the states actively rebelling against the Union. It deliberately ignored all the enslaved people in the border states that had stayed loyal to the North. So it was really designed to cripple the South's labor force and war machine rather than serving as some sweeping moral declaration of absolute human rights.
Actually, the real catalyst for change was happening from the ground up. During the Civil War, 500,000 enslaved people abandoned plantations and fled toward Union lines. As W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out, this was essentially a massive general strike. By just stopping their work and walking away, they threatened the entire Confederacy with starvation. They practically forced the Union Army's hand to recognize their emancipation. So, Zinn's historical analysis suggests that the government ultimately moved to abolish slavery to head off a full-scale grassroots rebellion, one that could have threatened the entire capitalist structure of the country. By ending slavery through a tightly controlled government war, the dominant political and economic classes basically ensured that the resulting reconstruction of the nation stayed safe, manageable, and, most importantly, profitable for their interests. Which brings us to Section 3, the illusion of freedom.
Take a look at this timeline. It visually maps out what the sources describe as the incredibly rapid rollback of Reconstruction. You have this brief, hopeful window where the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act promise true equality. But then, Southern states immediately enact these restrictive black codes to control black labor. And by 1883, the Supreme Court straight up nullifies the Civil Rights Act, basically abandoning black Americans to a completely hostile post-war South. A massive, foundational blow to this supposed new freedom was all about land. General Sherman had actually issued an order granting 40 acres to newly freed families so they could build self-sufficiency. But President Andrew Johnson quickly reversed that order and handed the land right back to the former Confederate owners. Without land ownership, former slaves were systematically forced right back into economic dependence on the exact same people who used to enslave them.
So, stripped of land and federal protection, this whole new system of oppression just took over. Using brutal legal and economic loopholes, the Southern economy was re-engineered. You had debt peonage and sharecropping keeping black farmers trapped in endless cycles of debt. Then there was the convict lease system. A black man could be arrested for some minor, made-up offense, thrown onto a chain gang, and his labor would be sold to private contractors. It mirrored the exact conditions of slavery. And the whole thing was violently enforced by the terrifying rise of the Ku Klux Klan and rampant lynchings.
W.E. Du Bois really hit the nail on the head when he wrote about this era. He argued that the betrayal of black Americans wasn't just some moral failure, it was deeply tied to the rise of a new capitalist order. This new system absolutely thrived on dividing the working class. It exploited both poor black and poor white workers just to squeeze out maximum profits for the elite at the top. And that leads us to our final section, the continuing struggle. You see, these historical threads of profit-driven exploitation, forced labor, and racial control, they didn't just magically vanish when the calendar turned to the 1900s. As activists like Angela Davis have pointed out, these systems simply evolved. The convict lease system morphed into the modern prison-industrial complex. The black codes turned into Jim Crow segregation and engineered urban poverty. The mechanisms definitely changed, but those underlying motives, control and exploitation, stayed exactly the same.
The sources bring us to the writings of George Jackson, a black revolutionary who spent years in solitary confinement. His book, Blood in My Eye, which he wrote from inside prison, perfectly embodies Zinn's thesis. The black revolutionary spirit survived every single systemic attempt to crush it. The resistance didn't die out, it literally just relocated from the plantation to the prison cell.
Jackson had this profound realization that really echoes Frederick Douglass from a century earlier. He wrote, "I've been in rebellion all my life. I just didn't know it." Jackson saw that his personal struggles and run-ins with the law weren't just individual failings. They were intimately tied to this massive historical system of control. Once he understood the historical economics behind his oppression, his supposed criminal rebellion transformed into a deeply conscious political one.
Angela Davis analyzed this exact dynamic too. Looking at the history of the working class, she concluded that the deeply ingrained racism and violence in America aren't just historical accidents. The sources argue they're the inevitable tools used by what Davis describes as a ruthless economic system. By intentionally keeping poor black and white workers divided, competing with each other, and hateful toward one another, the system protects itself. It makes sure that the constant drive for profit just goes completely unchallenged.
So I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to chew on. If, as these historians and activists argue, emancipation was historically orchestrated to set safe limits and protect an economic hierarchy rather than grant true, absolute freedom, what is required of us right now? History shows us, just like Frederick Douglass said, that power concedes nothing without a demand. So looking forward, how is this unbroken, centuries-long chain of resistance going to shape our future? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.